What's up guys? So today I wanted to talk about solder wick specifically because let's be honest, while a solder sucker or a desoldering gun can be nice for through-hole components, when we're working with surface-mounted stuff, they become pretty much useless. And we're usually left with the only other option, which is wick. I had a ton of trouble when I was first starting understanding how to properly use wick. This is one of those things that made me feel like I was horrible at soldering and feel like I would never learn how to do this the correct way. When in reality, just a few little tweaks to the way I was doing things drastically improved the outcome for me. Now, unfortunately, I had to learn all this stuff the hard way after years of doing it the wrong way. But I'm hoping this video can kind of skip a few of those steps for you guys and give you some tips that will turn your absolute hatred for desoldering and wicking into a love for this stuff. Wick has become my best friend, and it used to be my worst enemy, so I'm hoping I can do the same for at least a couple of you guys out there. First, before we go too much further, let's just stop normalizing these horrible little containers for wick. These containers are just super annoying to work with. There's no good way to store them that I've found, and you get like 2 inches of wick in these things. So instead, if you guys are planning on soldering for any extended period of time, I highly recommend grabbing your wick on a roll like this, and then get yourself like a dispenser for your solder and your wick like this. I'll have a link in the description for this wick as well as for this stand. But yeah, I love this super wick from MG Chemicals. It's incredible, and I absolutely love how it comes on this roll, so I can just throw it in my dispenser here. And I can just pull it out and cut off exactly how much I want to use. And I never have to deal with these things anymore. Alright, to demonstrate these tips, I'm going to be using this scrap T-con board, just so I can visualize some of the points for you guys. Number one, and this is something that I say all the time in my videos, but use a small piece of wick instead of using it off the roll. So instead of just using it like this, or if you have one of these, using it like this. And while this can work, I really don't recommend it because what's happening is wick is designed to be an extremely good conductor of heat. And the reason for this is solder likes to go where heat is. And the whole point of this is to take the heat from your iron or the hot air station and soak up the solder like a sponge. The issue is because it's so good at conducting heat, the iron that you're putting into the wick is spreading out through this whole length of the wick instead of just where you want it to wick the actual solder. So instead of giving your iron more that it has to heat up, just take a little bit off, like even just this much. And now the heat from your iron can only spread so far through the wick while you're using it. When I have a piece of wick cut like this, I really like to use these blunt tweezers because they're the exact same size as my wick and they do a really great job holding the wick. Okay, so I just pulled off a bunch of these components so I can demonstrate a couple things. The other thing I want to mention along with this point of cutting your wick down to a smaller size is to also cut it at an angle or a shape or bend it into a shape that is going to make your life significantly easier. For example, if I'm just wicking away all this stuff, like this size works fine. But let's say I was just coming in here to wick this like one little tiny dot here on the bottom. Dealing with this big piece of wick is completely unnecessary for that one little dot. And we're probably going to end up wicking some solder off of this cap inadvertently. So to avoid this, what I would do is instead of keeping my wick like this, I would just take the wick, just cut it at an angle like this. And now we have a nice little point like this that we can use to come in and just grab the one little dot right there and not touch the cap. This little trick is especially useful when you're doing BGA rework and you mess up on a couple solder balls and they combine. I use this all the time. You've probably seen me do it a bunch in my BGA videos. The other thing I like to do is if it's a really tight space, sometimes this point isn't quite enough to actually like grab that little dot, for example, because there's not enough wick there. What I like to do in this case is just cut a little bit of the tip off so it's more of like a trapezoid. So I still cut it at an angle, but then I cut the tip off. And what this does is it makes a nice little trapezoid like this. It allows you to still be precise, but put more wick over the point that you're trying to remove solder from. A good example of where bending the wick can come in handy is, let's say for example we have this huge inductor right here. I know this isn't actually on the board, I just want to use this to stress my point. So like, let's say we're trying to wick this stuff here, but we don't want to wick over here. This can obviously be really annoying because you want to come in from this side, but you're going to have to like use your iron to like bend the wick down into that corner. What I like to do is just take the side of my tweezers like this, pinch the amount of the wick that you want to be touching the board, and then just like bend it down like this. And now you have this nice little right angle. And then I'll grab the wick like this, and you can bend it one more time down like this, and you kind of have this like nice little Z shape. And this makes your life so much easier when you're in a situation like this and you immediately have a flat surface to work with instead of having to like push the wick down in the corner with your iron. So tip number one, again, is to cut the wick to a smaller size so that your soldering iron isn't having to do more work than it needs to, and then cut it and bend it in a shape that's going to suit your needs the best. Tip number two, which took me way too long to figure out, is that solder on boards from the factory is almost always going to be unleaded solder. The problem with unleaded solder and wicking unleaded solder is that it has a higher melting temperature. So again, similar to using too long of a piece of wick, you're going to have to use a higher temperature on your iron to account for the higher melting temperature of the solder on the board. Not only is this going to make your life way harder when you're going to wick, it's also going to make it a lot easier to accidentally damage pads and ruin the board. This is exactly why you see a lot of repair technicians adding solder onto the board before desoldering or before wicking the solder off the board. There's two kinds of solder I recommend you use to do this. One of them is going to be Eutectic 6337 leaded solder. 6337 refers to the alloy used to create the solder itself, the amount of tin and the amount of lead that's actually in the solder wire. You'll find different percentages of these with various solder, but the magic part about 6337 solder like this is that it has the lowest melting temperature of all of the tin lead alloys. This is called the eutectic alloy. And for tin lead eutectic solder like this, it melts at 183 degrees Celsius, which is way lower than the 200 plus degrees Celsius that the unleaded solder melts at that comes from the factory on boards. So this stuff is really good to use. You can get it in different thicknesses, and I'll have a link to this in the description as well. I definitely recommend grabbing this on rolls too like this and pop it on the same stand. The other type of solder you can use to mix in to lower the melting temperature is this stuff right here. This stuff goes by a ton of different names. I generally refer to this stuff as low melt solder. It also goes by chip quick. This particular stuff is called fast chip. There's all sorts of weird names for it, but the whole purpose of this stuff is to make your life a lot easier when you're removing components or wicking up solder. This stuff generally melts at a way lower temperature than leaded solder, and it's not just tin and lead, so it's different alloy with different metals. To make it an extremely low melting temperature, it's generally under 100 degrees Celsius that it takes to melt this stuff, so really, really low temperature. And I only really recommend using this if something is really stubborn. I generally won't mix this in if I'm wicking off solder from surface mounted components like these, and I just stick to this stuff. And while I do use this all the time and it is my main go-to solder for actually soldering things onto the board, that is not the case for the low melt solder. You should never use low melt solder to actually solder things to the board because of its super, super low melting temperature. Again, I'll have a link to this stuff in the description. It looks kind of expensive for how much you get, but a little goes a long way with this stuff and it really lasts forever. But again, that is completely unnecessary for 99% of cases, especially with surface mounted stuff. I definitely would just go with the 6337 leaded solder. So I'm just going to use these two pads here to show you the difference between wicking without mixing in leaded solder and with. So I'm just going to cut a small piece off of wick like this, just like we talked about before. And we're going to try to wick off this stuff from the board. Okay, and as you can see, that did work, but it took a few passes there with the iron. So now instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just mix in some leaded solder with this. Again, this is just the 6337 eutectic stuff. So I'm just going to mix a bunch in here, keep the iron on for a sec just to make sure it really mixes in. And there we go, we have a nice mix of leaded and unleaded in here. And I'm going to use the exact same piece of wick here. I just flipped it around. That's the other nice part about cutting wick is you can just flip it to use the other side. I'm going to come in and do the exact same thing here, just like this. And you can see how much faster that was at pulling all the solder off. My wick wasn't getting stuck and there's a tiny bit left, but we can come back and just grab that pretty easily with one more pass. And there we go. This is like super clean and took a lot less time than the one above. And to demonstrate this in a bit of a different way here, I'll just mix in leaded on this right hand side here. So we're just going to mix a bunch of it in just like this. I'll let it dry. Then I'm going to come in with hot air. We're going to go to 330 degrees Celsius. And to be fair, I'll put flux on both. And I'm applying hot air now to both sort of in the middle. And take a look at which one is going to melt first. See how the one on the right is fully melted already? And the one on the left still isn't fully melted. And there you go. After a little bit of time, it's fully melted. But you can see very clearly the difference between the two. And you can see there that the leaded solder stayed melted for longer than the unleaded one. So I'm telling you guys, this makes a huge difference when you're wicking. Mix leaded solder in. Don't skip this. It's going to make your life so much easier when you're wicking. Before we move on with the next point, I just wanted to show you this board repair course that iFixit is putting on and partnering with Justin from The Art of Repair. You've probably seen this guy around on YouTube. He's an incredible teacher with a wealth of knowledge about board repair. And Alex from the Repair Academy over in Europe, who's training hundreds of techs every year with a similar board repair course. And these guys are offering in-person training at the iFixit HQ in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's a 12-day intensive starting next month that's going to be extremely hands-on, and it's actually going to get your hands dirty with microsoldering and board repair and everything you need to learn in order to start repairing boards yourself. Like I keep talking about in my videos, the only way to learn this stuff is to actually start doing it. And there's no better way to learn to just start doing this kind of stuff alongside people who have been in the industry. If you think my videos are helpful, these guys have been in the industry far longer than I have, and they really know their stuff. I got in a couple calls with Justin and Alex in the past few weeks. They walked me through some of their course material on the calls, and it is absolutely phenomenal. But I think the most important thing about this course is that it's not just course material, it's actually getting your hands dirty with board repair for 12 intense days, 148 hours within the 12 days. So this is not like you're going to be fixing one or two things here and there. This is going to be diving in for 148 hours within 12 days and soaking up all the experience you could possibly get from this course. It's $6,500 for the course. You don't have to bring anything. They're going to provide all of the tools and stuff that you're going to use, and you even get to take home a bit of a toolkit. If you're the kind of person that's wanting to break into the board repair industry and you just don't know how to take that first step to gain that experience, this course is an incredible opportunity to gain that experience like really, really fast alongside some people who have been doing this for quite a long time. So if this is at all interesting to you, you can sign up from this link here. I'll have it in the description, and you can use the discount code NANOFIX in order to take $100 off of your order. Full disclosure, if you do sign up using my coupon code, I will get a bit of a kickback. But outside of that, these guys aren't paying me to say anything nice about them or to push the course in any way. I just have a ton of respect for these guys and what they're trying to do. Again, I know this is short notice because it's coming up in a month on July 7th, but this is an incredible opportunity if you were trying to learn this kind of stuff. If you have any questions about the course, definitely hit up the link in the description and schedule a call with Justin and throw all of the questions that you have at him to see if the course is right for you. So without further ado, let's jump back into the board and go over some extra tips. The next tip is to always use Flux when you're wicking. Wick oftentimes comes with Flux in the wick itself, but it's not enough generally. You're really going to make your life significantly easier by adding Flux while you're wicking. It's kind of working, but it's not really getting all of the solder. There you go. You can see there actually the residue from the Flux in the wick itself. So this actually did help the wicking process a bit, but I did have to go over it a couple times there. Now let's try that again with some Flux. Again, using the exact same bit of wick, just flipped it around, and watch how quick this is going to be. You can see it's promoting the flow of solder into the wick, and it's already done. Additionally, if you're wicking the same area over and over, try to clean off this used brown Flux from the board before trying to wick again. This stuff is not going to help you nearly as much as fresh Flux after cleaning it. This next step is really important and really screwed me over when I first started doing this, and I couldn't figure out why I sucked so much at wicking, and this was one of the main reasons that screwed me. And it's a bit counterintuitive. You actually want to have solder on your iron tip while you're wicking, because this is going to promote heat transfer between your iron and the wick when you're going to wick. And the hotter the wick gets, the easier and the smoother it's going to be to wick solder off the board. The reason this becomes a problem so often when you're wicking is because the wick not only takes solder off the board, but it takes solder off of the iron tip itself. Take a look at the side of the iron I was using on the wick just now versus the side that I wasn't. You can see the side I wasn't using has some solder on it versus the one that I was using. So every time you go to wick, add solder to the side of the iron that you're using to wick. You kind of want your tip to look a little bit like this. Not too much solder, you don't want a huge glob, but just enough so that when you go to wick, it promotes heat transfer between your tip and the wick. This right here is not going to do nearly as good of a job at transferring heat to the wick as this is. I can't stress this point enough. This is huge and this really makes a difference. And what this means is that you're going to need to tane your iron every time you wick. Don't just wick and keep wicking and keep getting new wick and stuff. That's not going to work. In between the times you're using the wick, you have to tane your iron tip. One of the main things that happens when you don't keep your iron tin while wicking is your iron and your wick is going to get stuck on the board. And this is because not enough heat is going into the wick from your iron. Even if you have your iron at a good temperature, your iron can't effectively transfer heat into the wick without a little bit of solder in between. Let me try to show this to you as well. This is especially the case with bigger pads like these, so let me try to see if I could show you what I mean. So for the left one, I'm going to use this side of my iron with basically no solder on it versus this side which has solder. So we're going to use this side that I just wicked with, and hopefully you guys will be able to see what I mean. So if I press against this, look, it's not even able to melt the solder. It's just kind of scraping. It's just not doing anything at all. Okay, after a little while I was able to do it, but I had to keep the iron there for a little while. And probably what actually happened is enough solder came through to tin the iron itself. And you can see that's actually the case here. There's more solder on the iron there at the tip than there was when we started. Whereas now on the right hand side here, I'm going to use the tin side of the iron like this that has a bit of solder already on it. And look at how big of a difference this makes. Look at that. It's already no problem at all for the iron to heat the wick up enough. Note that I didn't mix in any leaded solder with either of these, and I'm also using a pretty low temperature on the iron just to stress this point, but you can really see the difference it makes. The last tip I'll mention here is to not be afraid to use a nice high temperature on your iron when you're wicking, because in an ideal situation when you're comfortable wicking, you're not going to actually be touching the board necessarily with the temperature on your iron. You have to keep in mind that your iron is on top of the wick, which is touching the solder, which is touching the pad, which is on the board. So there's a lot of layers there that heat needs to travel through in order for the wick to actually pull the solder off of the board. So don't be too scared to use like upwards of 425 degrees on your iron to get that sufficient amount of heat into the wick in order to actually wick smoothly. In an ideal scenario, wick should glide smoothly over the board while you're wicking. It shouldn't get stuck and it shouldn't be hard to move it around like you saw in a few of the examples I was showing, because I was actually purposely using a lower temperature to stress some of these points, but you could see that that lower temperature was inhibiting me to go smoothly over those points with the wick. You also do not want to be using a really tiny tip like this to wick, because again, this is going to be really difficult to transfer enough heat into the wick to glide smoothly over the board, even if you have the iron at a good temperature. So a tip like this is really not sufficient for wicking unless you're wicking really tiny pads. And a tip like I'm using here, I really would only use this in the case of wicking smaller pads like BGA pads and things like that, where I need to be more precise. Wherever I can, I'll prefer to use a big tip like this, like the one I have on my Hakko iron here, and I'll use a high temperature like 400 plus degrees Celsius with this really large tip. So with all of these tips combined, we're going to try wicking off all of the solder we can see here from all the components I've removed. And you're going to see just how easy it is to glide over all of these when you mix in leaded solder, when you cut a piece of wick, when you use a sufficient temperature on your iron, and a sufficiently large iron tip. It is absolutely night and day. So what we're going to do first is I'm just going to take a bunch of solder, probably turn the fume extractor on, just tin the iron a ton. We're going to get a nice big glob of leaded solder on here, and we're going to mix this in with all the solder on the board. So we're just going to mix this in with all this stuff here. Flux is our friend here. And you really don't need to put pressure on the pads. You can just glide over all these points with the ball of solder on the end of your iron. Now I'll clean my iron and tin it just a tiny bit. We're going to take our wick and just come in and look how nicely this just glides over all of these pads here. And here you can see the wick is already like completely saturated. This is just going to spread solder around at this point, so I'm going to flip it. You can see it just glides over these pads, no problem. At this point, my wick is basically fully saturated, so I'm going to grab a new piece. We can also use a foam cube here to just grab all this old flux off the board. You can see all of the used up flux there that is browned, so we want to get that off the board. And then we can apply fresh flux to the points that still need wicking. Again, going to double check my iron is tinned at least a tiny bit on the top there. And we can come back in and get these wicked up. All right, because there was so much solder on the middle there, this is already full. So I'm going to flip it around. And you can see I'm not getting stuck at all. The solder is just coming right off of the board. For larger pads like this, you can kind of hold and watch the solder climb up the wick a little bit, and then it'll be clean. Again, we could just take a foam cube and get all this cleaned up. And for that whole area there, I only went through these 2 little bits of wick, which is actually not too bad considering how many big pads are there that we had soaked with leaded solder. So it only took like 2 small pieces here to get all the solder off of those big pads. So I promise you, if you follow these tips, you're going to love wicking a lot more than you used to. Cut your wick down to size and in a shape, and bend it in a shape that is going to suit your needs. Mix leaded solder in with the unleaded stuff on the board to lower the melting temperature. Use flux. Tin your damn iron so that it actually promotes heat transfer into the wick. And don't be afraid to use a higher temperature than you're used to when you're wicking solder off of the board. Believe it or not, by using a higher temperature, you're risking damaging the pads way less than you are by getting stuck on the pads and ripping them up. And also make sure you're using a sufficiently sized tip and not like a miniature bent conical tip like the one I showed you. If you're working on a board you care about and you're getting stuck and stuff, don't panic and pull on your wick, because you're going to be ripping lots of pads off with your wick when you do that kind of thing. Take a pause, let go of the wick, leave it on the board, and take a moment to reassess why there isn't enough heat going into the wick in order to make it easy for you to wick smoothly. The last thing I'll throw in here is that you can actually use your hot air to wick as well. You don't need to use your iron, and you can use the hot air as well to preheat the board so that you don't have to actually use so much heat when you go to wick the solder. You can preheat the board at like 200 Celsius, and it's gonna make wicking like way easier. One thing I'm gonna try here too, which I actually don't try this enough, and I need to try this more often, is you can actually use hot air to do the wicking. You don't even have to use your iron if you use enough hot air. So just to test this, let me just add a bunch of solder to these pads here. And let's see if we can't just only use the hot air to wick this stuff off. So I'm just gonna grab this bit of wick like this, and we're gonna try to like mop up this solder by just using hot air. So I'm gonna come in at like 400 here. Just get this all liquefied first. And let's see if this works to wick up this solder. Look at that, it's already done an incredible job at clearing the center there. I mean, that's pretty good. I'm gonna get rid of this wick and we're gonna get a new piece and try that again. Can add a bit of fresh flux on here, heat everything up again. Can also heat the wick up while we're melting the solder. And then let's try this again. I'm not putting too much pressure because I don't want to destroy the solder mask on the board. But I mean, yeah, that does an incredible job. So yeah, I hope these tips help you enjoy wicking as much as it's helped me. Again, these things have really taken something that I used to detest doing and turned it into one of my favorite and most satisfying parts of soldering, in my opinion. And I hope these things were just as helpful for at least some people. Again, I'll have affiliate links for all of the tools and things I used in this video in the description if you need to grab any and want to support the channel. But otherwise, I appreciate you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.